Welcome everybody to the Institute for Government. This is, I think, the longest day of the year, perhaps the hottest day of the year as well. So far the aircon's working well. Let's hope it continues. There's a lot happening at the moment. Obviously the Institute for Government is interested in elections and Queen's speeches and things like that, but we also don't lose our focus on the underlying operations of government and its effectiveness, and that's what we're focusing on today. We're asking the question, who's responsible for effective, efficient and secure digital government? I'm going to show you a few slides about the report that we're launching today, and we then have an excellent panel who will briefly give their thoughts and then have a bit of a discussion and then open up to the audience. My name's Daniel Thornton. I'm Programme Director here at the Institute for Government. I used to be a civil servant and I did some digital things in another part of the world, and came back to the Institute for Government a couple of years ago and trying to get the government to be more effective on the subject of digital government, amongst other things. So on the panel today we have Ciaran Martin, the Chief Executive of the National Cyber Security Centre. We have Janet Hughes, the Digital Leadership Director at Doteveryone, and we have Bryan Glick, Editor-in-Chief of Computer Weekly. Unfortunately, we don't have a representative from the Government Digital Service. We were expecting one until yesterday. Their non-appearance may, in fact, help us to answer part of the question that we have here today, something we can perhaps explore later on. Please do feel free to tweet during the presentation. You can see various tags on the screen. We're not planning any fire alarm today. So let me start with the internet, which is the wonder of our age and connects half the population of the planet and rising rapidly. And really adapting to the digital age is about adapting to the internet. But the internet comes with some problems as well as some great advantages. In May, many people went into their doctor's surgeries or hospitals and found this on their computer screen rather than the usual welcome. This is the WannaCry ransomware cyber attack, which affected 150 countries around the world, including, amusingly, the Russian Interior Ministry, but less amusingly, the National Health Service here. For several days, people were turned away from their hospital appointments. Operations were cancelled, and so on. So it was a big problem for the National Health Service and showed some of the weaknesses in the system that the government needs to make sure works securely. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about the private sector before I talk to you about the public sector. And there are no logos on here, but the four most valuable companies in the world now are digital companies. And they have really adapted to the internet age. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the way they work, because I think it is relevant to the way the government works. And it turns out that although there's a lot that's new in the way these new digital companies work. If you go back 10 years ago, the most valuable companies in the world were oil companies or banks, and 20 years and so on. It's definitely a new phenomenon here. Old economics can actually explain why these companies are so successful and powerful. So they have economies of scale in supply. You can have basically one website, Facebook, working for everybody who uses the internet. WhatsApp can manage to have 50 engineers and 900 million users, which is quite a lot of users and not many engineers. So there are economies of scale in supply that can use the whole internet. And there are also economies of demand, what we call the network effect. So people start putting things on Facebook and it creates content that makes it more valuable for their friends and family to use Facebook. and that drives exponential growth in the use of those platforms. Around the platforms that these companies have are a swarm of third-party providers, and a lot of the innovation comes from those companies or service providers, because it's quite hard to innovate in large hierarchical organisations, as government keeps demonstrating. So the platforms, these platforms like Facebook and Google and so on, connect to these third-party providers through standards, and I'm going to come back to that idea. Standard ways of connecting. They also have interoperability inside their organisations. Different bits of the organisation can share data easily and use services easily in other parts of the organisation. That's also a really important thing that is done in the private sector increasingly well and isn't done yet in government. So the first thing that I'm going to talk to you about, the ways in which government has got better in the last few years in some areas and not got so much better in others. The first thing I'm going to talk to you about is better web services. So prior to 2013, you'll see there were lots of different companies, lots of different departments providing their own websites, providing their own information for citizens. And after 2013, that got merged into gov.uk. And now, if you're a citizen, you don't actually need to know, is it the Home Office that I need to find, or is it, the Foreign Office or whatever if I want to get a visa. You just go to gov.uk and you find what you need. Now, this isn't to say that gov.uk is perfect, and certainly at the Institute we have our issues with it in terms of finding some information that we need. But I think for the average user it is a lot better. So web services have definitely got a lot better. Third-party services, the swarm that I was talking about around the big platforms in the private sector, not so much has happened here. Before 2009, there were some services. HMRC released APIs to third-party providers, and they could help you file your tax online, and that was useful. Since 2009, when data.gov.uk started, things have definitely got better. There is a lot more data out there, better data. DEFRA has managed to organise the release of data in such a way that a third-party provider can give you an alert about any river you're interested in, whether it's flooding or not, and whether the water's low. There are sensors in all the different rivers up and down the country. You can get an alert about those different rivers. This is definitely very useful. It provides services to citizens and data, and then perhaps the citizens start to communicate with each other in a network way. So there's been something on this, on third-party services, but not nearly as much as there has been on the web services. And then on the internal organisation of government, you'll see there aren't any dates on here, because really, the current situation is a lot of the data interchange between departments is civil servants emailing each other with spreadsheets attached to the email. Certainly that's what I used to do, sharing data when I was a civil servant, and a lot of it still happens. Of course, that's not the whole story. There are some better exchanges of data, better ways of exchanging data, but it's a pretty ad hoc system. What we're a very long way from is a kind of modular system where every bit of government and the public sector can talk to every other bit of government and public sector in a standard way. And out of that, if you're a permanent secretary or director general or something in a department, or you run an agency, you get management information as an automatic exhaust from the operations of that system. You don't have to have a separate system where somebody goes around with a kind of clipboard or puts some PowerPoint together and emails it round to everybody, and they consider it, and then it's already out of date and its data's no good, and so on. So that's the way management information works at the moment in Whitehall. So in terms of the internal organisation of government, very little progress, I think, of the three ways of working. More happy story in terms of the digital marketplace. So traditional procurement departments have a limited number of contractors. They know them well. They advertise for contracts, and people provide services to government. The digital marketplace has been pretty successful. 1.8 billion through it in the last couple of years. Lots of small, medium enterprises providing services to government now when people want either people to go and work, contractors, or to buy software, or to use to get storage on the cloud. All of that works now pretty well through the digital marketplace. However, and the marketplace uses the power of the internet, because you can have one marketplace with lots of people on the government side interested in purchasing services, or the public sector side interested in purchasing services, and lots of suppliers on the other side of the transaction. So it's really starting to use the power of the internet. However, 94% of government tech spending is still with large companies. Now, there's nothing wrong with large companies if they've adapted to the internet age and they're using open standards and so on. But government's objective is to open up to SMEs, and that's really not happened. Now, I have one word for you, and that word is standards. The way that the internet is based on standards. The internet is partly about computers getting more powerful and ways of connecting them getting more powerful, but it's also about standards and the ways that computers communicate with each other. And GDS has actually been really successful. The Government Digital Service in the Cabinet Office has been really successful in promulgating its standards. The service standard is almost unique in standards put out by the Cabinet Office, in that people put it up on their wall and they use it in different parts. It's been taken up in Australia, and local government has started to take an interest in it. So compared to most standards that the some Cabinet Office people in the room, certainly many people, many Cabinet Office standards and a lot of guidance from Cabinet Office, really doesn't have much impact across government. But GDS's standards have been pretty successful. What we argue in the report is they need to make their standards clearer, they need to extend them across the public sector, and they need to make them cover standard ways of exchanging data more. So they need to, our suggestion in the report is that there should be an API store that people can use wherever they are in the public sector, that over time becomes a set of standards for government. So I think GDS has had a focus on standards. I think it should have an even bigger focus on standards, and that would have the sort of impact that we need to see across government. The other word I have for you is, these are two words, implementation plan. So the transformation strategy was put out in February after a long wait. I think it was a good strategy. It had lots of good words about things that the government was going to do, and they were very sensible things. It didn't have any implementation plan. It didn't have any allocation of resources. It didn't say what would be done by when, with a few exceptions. As those of you who know government well, if you don't say, this is what we're going to do by when, and it doesn't necessarily happen at that time frame, but you don't get people's attention. It's all, oh yeah, that's a nice aspiration. We can ignore that safely. So another recommendation we're making today to government is that they publish an implementation plan for the transformation strategy to give it some bite. And another thing that the strategy didn't do is establish priorities. So there was a list of digital services that would be created by 2020, and they included some things that are really important to Brexit. Bryan was talking about this yesterday. If we're going to do Brexit, you're going to need some new services. They better be digital, and they better be good. So some of the things on that list were, I've got to come and I want to come and work in the UK, or I want to move to the UK or whatever. Vital to the operation of Brexit. And then you also had on that list, I want to fish. So that's great. It's important for some people, make it easy for people to get a fishing license, but it's not a priority really. I mean, for the government as a whole to put out in a transformation strategy. So you need a prioritisation process, and you need to make sure your resources are focused on the most important services. And to do this, you have to have somebody who's clearly in charge. So in the run-up to the election, we were saying government should appoint a Minister for Digital Government. Now, there will, in due course, I think, be somebody in the Cabinet Office who has the responsibility for Minister of Digital Government, but Damien Green, who's, First Secretary of State and so on, will be an influential member of the government. He's going to be busy, I think, with Brexit. And then underneath him, there are two parliamentary secretaries. So, I mean, there's a leader of the House and so on, as usual in the Cabinet Office. But in terms of ministers working on Cabinet Office business, it's really not clear where the authority is going to come from. Now, ministers, this isn't all about ministers. It's extremely important that the leadership of departments gets digital. And I think there's a really variable picture still across Whitehall. Some parts of the public sector have properly started to move into the digital age, but many parts have not. And I think that's a really important issue that I know some permanent secretaries are very concerned about, and it's something the Institute and others are keen to help with. So I just want, before we finish, I want to come back to the secure question, particularly as we've got Ciaran here today with us, and indeed Janet is talking about Verify, subject close to Janet's heart. So one of the things you want to do in the digital age, and one of the things that government definitely has to do, is make sure there's a good secure system for working out who it's talking to online. The previous system was that you would interact with a government department or an agency, and they would, through some process or other, identify you. But there was no sharing of that system across the government and the public sector, or very limited sharing. And the one system there was, the government gateway, had some issues, and I think isn't up to the latest security standards. When the coalition came in 2010, they decided to get rid of the National Identity Register along with national ID cards, and that creates a challenge for identifying who you're talking to online. And Verify, the system that Janet helped to steward for many years, sidesteps that problem elegantly by getting the private sector to do the identification of the citizens. There's this new system. The transformation strategy said this is the system we're going to use. Conservative manifesto said this is the system we're going to use. But Gateway persists, this system that HMRC has been using, and it's perhaps something we can explore. Why it's carried on being used. It's still used with 130 or more government services. And one of the big issues that's been ducked, I think, in the last couple of years is really sorting out which is the identity verification system that you need, that the government's kind of put its resources behind. So finally, if government doesn't spread standards, across the public sector to the NHS, working with local government and so on, then I think we are unfortunately going to see more of this. So there's a lot of potential in adapting to the digital age, but there's also clearly some risks, and I think now we'll have a bit of discussion about that on the panel before we open up for questions. Penultimate slide. This is the report we're launching today. It's online. If you're really lucky, you might get a hard copy. Where's Lucy? There's Lucy. Lucy at the back, my co-author of this report, including some people in the room we've interviewed over the last few months, contains the recommendations that I've been talking about today. Read it, it's great. So I'll now invite each member of the panel to really just for a couple of minutes, maximum couple of minutes, comment on what they've heard or on anything else that they want to talk about, and I'll go this way across the panel. Ciaran.
Thank you, Daniel. Morning, everyone. So your question is, who is responsible for effective, efficient and secure digital government? It's always easy when they're not here to say that it's somebody else. So I will start there. In joined up government, the Government Digital Service representative sent me their notes last night to say what they were going to say. Unfortunately, in the spirit of joined up government, it's linked to a SharePoint that I didn't have access to, so I have no idea what they were going to say. Janet will know the spirit of what I'm talking about. I think, in all seriousness, something has happened in the last 2 to 3 years in the UK in terms of digital government, which is obvious and necessary, but shouldn't be taken for granted. I think at the start of this decade, the digital transformation agenda, world leading in the UK, and the cybersecurity agenda, equally at its best, were pulling in different directions. The digital transformation agenda was transformative, it was deliberately disruptive, and there was a sense that the security dimension to this was a break and a block. If you don't believe me, have a look at the 2 national cybersecurity strategies published this decade. The 2011 National Cybersecurity Strategy has no mention of digital government anywhere. It's extraordinary. It talks about a very ambitious plan to sort out all sorts of things in the private sector and high-end national security risks. It does not mention securing public services. Why? Bluntly, I think enough time has passed we can talk safely about this, because it would have, those in charge of transforming digital public services feared it would slow them down if we started talking too much about security. And certainly in our bit of the forest, what's now the National Cybersecurity Centre, part of GCHQ, we weren't configured in that way where we could go in and help secure more modern public services. It was still, this is too risky, putting these services online is leaves the citizen exposed to too much danger, and therefore don't do it, rather than the way we're now doing it, which is to try to make it safe. So a flagship programme for us, smart meters, a national programme to measure energy consumption much more effectively, use infrastructure including made all over the world, including large parts of it in China. How do you do that? How do you make that safe? Well, we've published an extraordinary amount of information about how we do 2 things. One is the trust and verify parts of the different parts of the system, how they communicate with each other. And the second is the off switches. How much damage could one attack do? We will tolerate risk. If a sophisticated attacker went after the smart meter of any one person in this room, or any or individual organisation in this room, they could probably do quite a lot of damage. To do national level damage is actually quite hard. You'd have to do, in our doctrine, 3 sophisticated sort of state level attacks at once, which would be an act of, which would be an obvious act of aggression against the UK before you can do national level damage. So I think there is something now about the join up between the digital transformation agenda and secure digital government. The second point, because I think we should leave, the second of 2 points, because I think we should leave time for questions, which is, governance, risk management and so forth, all very important. But there's something much more basic than that. Most cyber attacks are rubbish. Most cyber attacks are unnecessary, preventable and of poor quality. It's a subject shrouded in mystique, and it shouldn't be. It's taken the UK quite a long time to realise this. Make no apologies for this, because it's taken other countries even longer. For the last decade, national Western cybersecurity strategies have been shouting at people, to telling them to do things better and to share information. Demonstrably, we now have 10 years of evidence that that doesn't really work. There's lots of talk about governance, there's lots of talk about using the private sector, whatever that means. I don't think, and I noticed the Trump administration is rowing back from this language, that somehow there's some sort of structural gap between quality of cybersecurity in the private sector and the public sector. There isn't. The private sector on average, outside certain sectors, including finance, is no better on average across the globe than the public sector. But we've had 10 years of this sort of language, which has enabled parts of the industry, and I noticed you mentioned sort of, the big companies and perhaps some of the blockers to SMEs getting involved in this space. There's been quite a lot of this which is run on fear and run on a sense that you don't need to understand this risk, you don't need to manage it, you just need to pay somebody to tell your board that it's in hand. We have to move away from that, and so instead of just shouting at people to do it better and telling them to share information, you just got to go out and fix things. There's an awful lot of market failure in cybersecurity, an awful lot of things where market forces would normally fix problems where they're not being fixed. So I'll give you 2 quick examples about things, just practical hard problems that we're trying to solve as government, to show you the sort of approach. One is the way traffic flows are routed in terms of DDoS attacks. So if you remember back to September 2016 and the attack on the DNS provider DIN or DINE, depending on how you wish to pronounce it, which knocked over Twitter and Amazon for about 6 hours on the east coast of the States. How did that work? Well, hundreds of thousands of CCTV cameras were hijacked by an attacker, and they were just pointed at DIN, DINE. What was the economic problem? The cameras worked perfectly well throughout the attack. So if you were the manufacturer, the operator, or a customer of these CCTV cameras, you had no commercial incentive to pay for the upgrade in security to make these cameras unusable in a large-scale cyber attack. How do you stop this? This is all to do with the protocols by which telcos route traffic. This particular one is the Border Gateway Protocol, which was last updated in any meaningful way in 1972, and therefore clearly not designed for these sorts of situations. In the UK, we've got the telcos together to fix this, which won't solve the problem globally. It's a starting point, but it makes it much harder for UK infrastructure to be used in large-scale DDoS attacks. That doesn't mean it prevents DDoS attacks against the UK, because you can do it from somewhere else. What it does mean is that UK infrastructure is less valuable to an attacker because they can't hijack it. So that's one example. The second example is from, and I'll finish then, Daniel, the second example, which is quite well known now, is anti-spoofing. Spoofing a trusted brand is a very well-known and effective way of doing a cyber attack. So in the UK, historically, Revenue and Customs, HMRC, has been the most spoofed brand. Whether it's HMRC or Tesco's or any other organisation, public or private, actually there isn't a huge commercial incentive for the organisation being spoofed to pay to fix it, because actually, if you're spoofing a retailer, actually the retailer isn't losing money. The victims of the scam are losing money. They might lose a bit of trust. There are simple bits of code. We've published it now, the DMARC protocol, which authenticates, for the most part, it's not foolproof, but it's very, very good, authenticates genuine emails. So we rolled this out with HMRC last year. It says, if this doesn't look like an HMRC email, don't deliver it, don't send it to us. Sorry, don't deliver it, don't send it to the recipient, send it to us. We got 300 million of them in 2016, so we blocked 300 million spoof emails. That did two things, three things. One, it stopped 300 million attacks, the spoof emails being sent to people. Secondly, it gave us 300 million bits of data to show who was attacking. And thirdly, and most importantly, instead of this utterly rubbish and useless piece of advice to everyone in this room about how do you keep safe online by don't open untrustworthy links or untrustworthy attachments, how on earth are you supposed to know what an untrustworthy link or an untrustworthy attachment is? The email didn't arrive. You didn't have to take the decision. You took it away from the user. It's that sort of practical problem-solving thing, what we call active cyber defense. It means something different in America, so I won't dwell on the term too long. It's that sort of practical problem-solving, just looking at where the attacks are happening, where the market is failing to provide it. These are the answers. That's the basic defensive posture to take away most of the problem for most of the people most of the time.
Thank you, Ciaran. Janet?
Before I say anything about the question, I do want to say, in my 5 years of working in government, it's an unsung and really remarkable transformation that's happened in the security agencies, from being incredibly closed, insular and quite obstructive, to being open, practical and pragmatic in the way that they are now. And it's very, very infrequently talked about, but really to be welcomed, I think, that level of openness. So on to the question, who's responsible? I'd like to know who in Whitehall thinks they're not responsible for effective, efficient and secure digital government. Because digital technology is not a niche topic like phishing. And asking this question is a bit like asking who in Whitehall is responsible for the use of electricity. Like, we just wouldn't ask that question because we've moved on in our lives to an extent that we don't ask that question, we just accept it as a part of the fabric of our lives. So it's important to be asking this question and debating it publicly, if only as an indication that we're still asking that question as though digital is a niche topic, and we're still having the debate as though it's a niche topic that needs to be taken care of by a few people. And it isn't. Being an effective, efficient and secure government, because you might as well miss out the word digital, because you just take for granted that it uses electricity and digital technology, is everyone's responsibility. It's the Cabinet Secretary's responsibility and everyone who works for him. And it's not a question of which pieces of technology do you use, or what processes do you use, or even what standards do you use, although they are important questions. It's about the whole of government and how it works, its structures, its culture, the type of leadership that we see, the ways of working and its capability. So in terms of the structure, I don't know why we have government departments. I've worked in the public sector for 20 years and I worked in the Cabinet Office for 4 years, and I've absolutely no idea why government departments need to exist at all in a digital age. And I think we need to be asking that question, because unless you solve that set of problems, it's very difficult to solve problems to do with collaboration, platform ways of working, integration, etc. Related to structure is the incentive structure in government. Because we have these departments and because they've been established to protect a particular set of interests, they're highly incentivised to do things on their own, and they're disincentivised from collaborating in most cases, and that's why there are very few examples of cross-government collaboration actually working, or platform approach actually working. And so often that's discussed as though it's an issue to do with a specific product like Verify, which I was responsible for a few years, or a particular person who may have led GDS or led a different department. It's not. It's a systemic issue to do with the incentive structure in government. And then in terms of capability, that's a question that goes right to the very top in terms of our politicians. The quality of debate about digital is woeful in this country and in all others, and amongst the senior civil service, where it's still acceptable, as it is in business and the charity sector, by the way, to say, oh, I don't really do digital. It would be unthinkable for a permanent secretary to say, well, I don't really do money. So why is it okay to say I don't really do digital? It's not. And we need to, in a positive, constructive way, help our colleagues in senior roles to recognise that digital technology, understanding it, working with it, embracing it, and having a digital culture and approach is an integral part of their life and responsibility. I think it's important to think about this in the context of Brexit, because the classic civil service response to a crisis like this is to retrench and retreat into its kind of traditional ways of working. So you'll find documents being kept guarded very closely and secretly about what we're going to do about Brexit, and whereas I would argue that now is an absolutely the most critical time to do the opposite of that. There's a lot of people who can help with that set of debates and discussions, and it's absolutely not going to happen that people in government are going to deal with Brexit on their own in an effective way. If that's the road that we go down, car crashes will happen left, right and centre. You can guarantee it. So Brexit is, whether you think it's the right thing for the country to be doing or not, it's an opportunity for government to think about how it works. Do we need departments, or should we be organised in a different way around platforms and functions and services? Do we need to be operating in this secretive, closed way? If GCHQ can open itself up, then the rest of government surely can have more open discussions about what to do. I think Daniel's absolutely right, and the report's absolutely right, to point out the need for an implementation plan. I think the thing to guard against with that is thinking that a list of things to do, even if it's prioritised, is actually that useful, because we've had lots of lists of things to do over many, many years in terms of digital government, and most of them don't get done. And so it's time to look at the reasons for that and the underlying causes of that, and address those in an implementation plan that looks at leadership, structure, incentives, culture and capability at all levels of the organisations that we're talking about. And finally, I think in relation to strategy, I've been doing some work on this for Doteveryone, and every digital strategy that you look at, almost without exception, is full of platitudes and lacks implementation plans. And then the very few organisations that have managed to transform themselves digitally, so I'd point at Lego or GE, for example, what they do is they talk about executing their strategy digitally. So not having a separate digital strategy and a digital team who's responsible, and everybody else saying, oh, it's all right, those guys, and they are guys, are dealing with that, so don't worry about it, we'll just carry on over here like nothing's happened. Instead of that, the entire organisation embraces digital in terms of its products, in terms of its services, in terms of its corporate culture and structures, in terms of its enterprise technology and all of the incentives that people have and the expertise that they have. And those organisations that have done that effectively have managed to bring about the sort of transformation that I think we really desperately need in government. And there's no organisation has been successful by having a digital team and a so-called digital strategy that's actually just platitudes and hoping that something useful will happen. And if the only way that's going to happen is organically over 30 years, by which time you'll be irrelevant and democratic representation will have been replaced by something else.
Whoa.
But, you know.
Okay, wide-ranging remarks there, thank you. The abolition of Whitehall, government, just about everything else.
I'm not saying abolish it, saying that,
Okay.
I love Whitehall. I've spent 20 years working in the public sector, don't get me wrong.
Thank you. Brian.
Thanks, Dan. I think, somewhat boringly, I'd have to echo pretty much everything Janet was saying there in many ways. As she was talking there, I was thinking, I can't say that now, and I can't say that now.
Sorry.
It's all right. I think, one of the points I was going to start on was I think Janet touched on at the end there. If you look at lessons in digital transformation across business, companies that have been either have been successful in transforming from the way that they used to work to the way they now work to becoming more digital, or if you look at companies that have grown up as digital natives, so to speak, to use another pretty hateful phrase. If you talk to the people at the top of those organisations who've made that change and say to them what was the key to it, they say it was the moment we realised that digital is not about technology, it's about business model change. It's about changing the way we work, the way we think, the way we're organised. In my own little microcosm, I've had experience of this. When I joined Computer Weekly, it was a relatively moribund print publication. We're now a digital brand. We've changed our business model completely. The way we work is completely different. The way we make money is completely different. And I think one of the things that when you look at government is, for all the talk of digital government, it still feels to me like that mostly what we've done over the last 5 years is develop a better digital services for government. We haven't changed the way government works at all. There hasn't been any real acknowledgement from the very top that you need to change the business model effectively of government. When you look at the forces that have driven business model change in the private sector, generally it's been because there have been new entrants or smart companies that have changed, and they've sort of forced change. There's this very overused phrase, digital disruption, that people use. And quite often, companies, if you look at who have digitally changed successfully, have done it because they've been forced to, because they've seen things happening in the market. Now, obviously, in government, generally speaking, government generally isn't forced to change, completely forced to change. I used to joke that the only way you'll digitally disrupt a government, we have words for that, it's either a coup or a revolution. Although perhaps over the last couple of weeks, maybe you might add a third way for it to happen instead. I think I absolutely agree with Janet's opener, which would have been the same as mine. The answer to the question, who's responsible, is everybody. But it's not going to happen until there is a realisation across government that government really has to completely change the way it works. I look at the civil service now, and it still looks to me like an essentially 19th century organisation that's trying to exist in the 21st century. When you look at what they're trying to do with digital, it sort of feels like the civil service is a train, and some smart people have come along and said, hey, everybody flies these days. So they said, all right, great, and they built a couple of wings onto the side of the train, and thinking, great, we've changed now, we've recognised the way things are going to be. But then everybody's looking out the windows running, but we're still running on the tracks. What's wrong? I think that I still think we're a long way from getting to that realisation that business model change is needed. Janet and I were talking earlier on. I liked the comments of the former Digital Minister Ed Vaizey, where he said, we should scrap government by department, and we should institute government by function. Digital cuts across so many areas. It is still, as Daniel's report points out, it's still nigh on impossible to get Treasury funding for cross-departmental projects. It's just not the way that people think. Yet so much of what you need to do if you're going to have a digital government is going to change things across departments, pull bits out of them, make people work together in different ways, and there's not a sense of that. And I absolutely agree that Brexit potentially is an opportunity to do that. We're going to have to rewrite so many of the ways we work, our laws and regulations in ways that we still don't really yet know, of course, but nonetheless there's going to be a lot of change brought in. You could almost make an argument that says, let's use Brexit as an opportunity to build on the side a whole new government that starts digitally. Let's keep the old ways going. Let's keep the civil service running the way it is. But let's, in parallel to that, start building a new civil service, a new Whitehall, a new government from digital foundations, from the ground up. That is going to be the government that we're going to have when we're outside of the EU. Now that's probably a bit ambitious, but nonetheless, I think as a principle and as an opportunity, it would be nice to see some thinking along those lines coming from within Whitehall.
Thanks very much, Bryan. So let's open it up to the audience. You've got the first question, and then the man next to you.
James Kidner from Improbable, a tech startup in this field. But first of all, thank you very much. Fascinating way to start a very long day, and we're all in your debt for it. Picking up Bryan's observations at the end, and like Janet, I came to Improbable from a career in public service, in my case the Foreign Office, and I think we beat ourselves up unnecessarily. I think the UK government is a long way in front of most other governments. Can you tell us who are the sort of poster boys for really effectively managing this digital transformation? It's a global phenomenon, and there's lots of lessons learned to be learned from elsewhere. Not all of them from Estonia, which, let's face it, is no more than a sort of tiny market town in this game.
Yep, let's take the second question and then we'll answer those two together. Yep.
Simon Judge from the Government Finance Function, so I don't work for a department anymore. If you had to make a choice between progress on services or progress on how government and policy making works, is there a choice between those two in terms of making progress, or is that a false dichotomy?
Thank you. So perhaps Janet, you worked around the world a fair amount, haven't you? So who are the poster girls and boys?
Do I have to restrict it to government? Because I think there aren't any that have become entirely digital organisations, and the reason for that is because it's really hard. It's not like, I think it's important not to be vindictive. It's really, I've worked in GDS for 4 years, and I can tell you that it and government is full of very talented, very committed people, very creative people, trying to solve incredibly difficult problems, and I think we do them a disservice if we kind of point to them and say, oh, well, you're not good enough and you're not going quickly enough, because I'd like to see someone who's built a better one, and they haven't. And there's a reason for that. It's hard. I think the couple of examples that I've been really interested in recently in the private sector, Lego is a really interesting one, and exactly as Bryan said, there was a burning platform there. They were about to go bust in 2002, and they were losing $1 million a day, and then they had to do something in order to survive. And as part of their transformation, they looked at what was their actual point of them existing, which bits of their organisation did they no longer need, and then they looked across the whole organisation and at how to execute their strategy digitally. So they looked at not only at their marketing, which is often where people start, but also their product development and their enterprise technology and everything else. And so they're now a famous kind of poster boy for digital transformation. They're often talked about in terms of business transformation, but there is a really interesting digital element to that. GE similarly did a similar thing of focusing on its core mission and then trying to work out how to do that core mission in a digital way. And so I think those two examples give some really good pointers. The other thing that neither of them did was have one sole person who was the chief digital officer. So in Lego's case, they had 30 across the whole business. And that's what you need to do if you want to bring about genuine wholesale change. You can't have a superhero and fly them in and expect them to change the entire way the organisation works. And when you think about it like that, it's kind of obvious.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think in terms of services versus the policy-making choice, I think it has been treated as though, we've behaved as though that's a choice, and I think it's probably right to start with services, because that's where you can demonstrate savings and an impact for users, and it's a kind of public-facing bit of government. But I think we've learned, and we've seen not just from government but from other examples, that if all you do is change that front bit and you don't look at the underlying infrastructure problems, cultural problems, ways of working, then you don't get the savings that you're hoping for. And in some cases, you actually create more cost, and there's been plenty of examples of that happening. I think that shouldn't be read as a criticism of anybody who's done anything, though, because if you look at the kind of Gartner work on pace layers of change, for example, it's inevitable that some things will change more quickly than others, and the front-end services are easier to change than the entire way the policy profession works. My argument would be, in terms of strategic approach, you need to look at the entire system. Government is a complex system, and it has complex interactions with the other systems, and if you don't look at all of it and what the incentives are and how different components relate to each other, then you'll risk spending lots of money changing one bit and making no overall impact, I'd say.
Thank you. Ciaran, so who are the most secure governments around the world? Clearly there are some top of the league tables in terms of doing the hacking, but...
like Janet on the other side, I wouldn't call out any particular exemplars. Again, it's hard. Again, across the West, as I said in my opening remarks, I think there's been a problem of strategic underachievement for the last 10 years or so. There are countries with quite strong records in digital secure government. So if you talk to Canadian counterparts, I mean, Canada has a generally admired public administration system, and its provision and security of its public services are consistent with that. Canadian colleagues would, however, admit that their protection of privately owned critical national infrastructure is perhaps not as up to the mark as other countries. I mean, the fundamental strategic problem we face is that services have grown up over decades across the Western economy on the basis of an internet infrastructure that was not designed with security in mind. Fixing that is difficult. Fixing that in terms of legacy systems is extremely expensive and disruptive. So you wait for the next generation of systems. We are, I think it was Janet who said that digital strategies across the world are full of waffle, and I would concur with that. I think one thing that we are reasonably proud of in the 2016 cybersecurity strategy is that it is quite specific. You do get an American audience that says, no, this doesn't say share information and do it better. It says implement DMARC, it says implement DNS filtering, it says, do this, that. Really quite specific points. So if, in the grand tradition of Whitehall anecdote-based policy making, if you look at the sheer volume of international studies of current UK strategy, there is some interest in this approach. So we're cautiously optimistic that at least some aspects of what we're doing are world leading.
Thank you, Bryan. Reflections on this?
Yeah, I mean, I remember a bizarre situation being effectively on the other side of a table with Francis Maud, with Andrew Neil interviewing both of us about 3 years ago, when the government put out a press release saying we have set the objective to be the most digital government in the world, and this was considered rightly an interesting thing to talk about. And Andrew Neil turned to me and said, "So, who are the big companies? How achievable are this?" And I think it's still the case. What I said at the time is, it's great to say you want to be the most digital government in the world, but it's not a particularly difficult race to win. They're absolutely right to say, Estonia is always held up as the example, but Estonia is not a great example, not just because it's small, but because it started from nothing. There was no legacy there. Its legacy was the old Soviet days. I think inevitably the problem that every government is having around the world in trying to go digital is legacy. It's the big problem that everyone in the private sector has got as well. Huge, if you go into any bank these days, any major retail bank, no matter how great their online banking app might be to you, their big problem is the huge amounts of vastly complex legacy systems that they have behind that are really preventing them from changing and becoming a really nimble, agile organisation. And every government still has that problem. How do you tackle that problem? How do you get rid of that legacy? GDS has been trying to things like spend controls, things like trying to get rid of all the old monolithic outsourcing contracts. These have proved to be very, very difficult things to do, and sadly we're seeing a lot of these being rowed back on and diluted now, which I think is a very negative step. We have now an interestingly named transformation strategy, designed to be the strategy that will help this particular government transform itself. I would still argue it's predominantly a technology transformation strategy, not a government transformation strategy. And as Daniel points out, there just aren't enough measurable elements to it, enough measurable objectives, enough clear steps to say how we'll get there. So I think to be fair to the intent of the UK government, the thoughts are still going in the right way. Having said that, I've been reading recently some new programs coming out of Italy and New Zealand, which are still planning. They haven't delivered yet. They're planning, but you're starting to see that some other governments now, their thinking is starting to go beyond the thinking that we've got in the UK now. We're still thinking a little bit the way we were 3 or 4 years ago, maybe, and other governments are starting to think a little more, a little better and a little more forward than we are. And this is another big part of the change. It's all very well having GDS, it's all very well having digital officers in all the departments, but digital is constantly changing. You can't say this is how what our digital plan is going to be, and we'll deliver it in 3 years, 5 years, whatever it's going to be, because by the time you've delivered it, the world has moved on and it's out of date.
Thank you. I mean, the example I'm keen on is Norway, and they publish all of their service standard assessments, and they at least believe in Norway that this does have an impact on getting all the different departments and agencies to improve the provision of services. I think GDS has really rowed back a bit on transparency and stopped publishing the service standard assessments, which is a shame. So I'd like to have a couple more rounds of questions. So Matthew, and then here at the front. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Matthew Trimming. I made a very modest contribution to Daniel's excellent report and do bits of work with Janet and GDS and the Treasury on digital, and chair a couple of software companies. Just a very quick observation in trying to answer the question, not so much from a civil service perspective, but why should this be on every minister's, particularly this government's minister's agenda, from Gavin Barwell outwards, really, is that if you look at either the Lord Ashcroft polling or the more recent Ipsos Mori, you have to be at least 44 before the Tories are on parity with Labour in terms of voting intentions and voting percentages. So I'm not saying digitise government and the Tory party are a shoo-in for the next election, just for clarity. But what I am saying is that there is a whole cadre of voters who will expect things to be done digitally in government, and that is a political imperative as much as a civil service imperative. So if I was the Prime Minister, I'd be worrying about that. So that's a quick observation. Quick question is, given what you said, Daniel, about Janet's pioneering work with Verify and the creation of the identity market, and one of your slides around identity verification, I'm just wondering what the panel's hopes are for Verify. It's one of the things in the manifesto that the DUP probably aren't going to be upset about, and therefore it will either die because of civil service inertia, or it'll blossom because people will take the opportunity to take the next step.
Thanks very much. Over the aisle here.
Thank you. My name's Siobhan. Thank you. My name is Siobhan Coughlin. I work at the Local Government Association. My kind of question really is picking up on what Ciaran was talking about, if you like, recognising what was perceived as the inherent tension between digitalisation, digital disruption and cybersecurity. How can we enable the public sector to understand and better manage the risks while benefiting from the opportunities of digitalisation, both for their workforce as well as their customers, and not stifle, if you like, the needs of the business?
Thank you. And just in front of Matthew, I think you had a question. Yeah.
Thanks. Stefan Janiewski from DWP. If the panel seems to agree that the answer to who is responsible is everyone, which easily slips into being nobody, and we have a government that is not yet ready to address the sorts of challenges that Janet and Bryan in particular were describing, one of the characteristics of almost all digital strategies, and indeed all strategies, is to assume that writing something down is tantamount to achieving it. So the vision is quite clear from what you've been talking about. What are the concrete steps that are realistic in today's world with today's constraints that move us in that direction, as opposed to are all coming back in a year and 5 years and repeating this conversation?
Thank you very much. So we've got a question about Verify, we've got a question about understanding risks and rewards, and we've got a question about concrete steps. Brian, do you want to kick off on any or all of those?
Yeah.
Briefly, please. Let's get another round of questions in.
If I can sort of start perhaps with one of the aspects of Matthew's question around the young people, I suppose, is the element of the question. We hear GDS has introduced the phrase of user need. Anybody who'd ever been in a meeting with Liam Maxwell would have been shown the back of his mobile phone. What is the user need and all this? And that's absolutely estimable. But I do think when we get into these conversations, and especially within Whitehall, we do tend to miss the fact that the user need is not what process to follow through when you're applying for carer's allowance or how the screen looks and that sort of thing. The user need is just to deal with government as quickly and easily and seamlessly as they possibly can, and just to get on with your life. User need. The user need is for the government to have as little influence in your life as possible, except when you need it. If you're looking for what young people need from government in that respect, probably what they do want is, what Gordon Brown once said in a speech. I'm sure the speech was written for him, and he probably didn't understand what he was saying. But he did talk about the idea of what we need is a MyGov app. That sort of concept. If you're a young person and you want to do government, you want to go into an app and say, I want to claim some benefits, or I've got to farm a tax, or I've got to find out when the bins are being collected. And having it's an easy, intuitive way to work. We're a million miles away from that. And I think just to mention where the second question was coming from, I think it's always important to remember that 80% of government services is delivered by local government, not by central government. And a lot of these discussions we have about who's responsible are very focused on Whitehall. And if you're really looking at user need, then most people's user need comes from local government, not from central government.
Okay.
Yep. I have plenty of things to say on all the others.
I'm sure you have, but listen. Perhaps Ciaran, I think it's right that you took over responsibility for local government and the NHS a couple of years ago, 18 months ago. So perhaps you can answer Siobhan's question in that kind of context. How's that going?
To take the last two questions together, so the question on everyone owns it, therefore no one owns it, and so on. I honestly get slightly bored of discussions like this, because I think, as one commentator once put it, ambiguity, uncertainty and doubt are inevitable features of government. And I think if you take this question and you try and analyse it to its extreme in the abstract, who's responsible for this, that and the other, you may come up with something. It will be imperfect. If you write it down, it will fall apart in first contact with reality, and it's a pretty pointless expenditure of time. At the moment, in a new subject like cybersecurity, and I think we went through the same thing in government, in digital government, you have a central function which is somewhere imperfectly described as somewhere between command and control, exhortation, power and influencing, and it depends on particular sort of stages in the cycle as to which mode it's operating in. And then you have the owners of public services, and where does exact risk ownership and delivery ownership rest between the two? Well, it's kind of shared, and it varies over time. So have I taken over local government? No. Local government is responsible for local government. Do I feel a shared risk with the NHS? Yes, because your first slide made it very abundantly clear that when there's an attack on that affects the National Health Service, even though it affects hundreds of thousands of organisations in 200 countries, who was on the TV? Well, me and Jeremy Hunt. So there's the public service and there's the national ownership. Is it worth defining where exactly that balance of accountability lies at a particular point in 2017? For my money, not really. It's sort of shared. The point is, what do you do practically about it? And I want to talk about local government. Siobhan's question was very much music to my ears. How do you line up digital and security? Well, the point is you do them together. And you try to, Liam's very powerful and enduring thing around, user need, and by this we're talking users in local authorities. You think about the sort of circumstances they find themselves in. In my last job, dealing with nothing to do with digital or cybersecurity, I did deal quite a lot with local government, and when you get out of SW1 and you go to small local authorities, you realise that some of the things we're saying, I can't really speak so much to the digital agenda, but some of the stuff we said on cybersecurity in the past is preposterous for small local authorities. You tell them, you should be doing this. You should be, looking at this risk, that risk. You should be employing this sort of commercial service. If any of these local authorities could afford this commercial service, which they can't, they couldn't afford to employ and wouldn't be able to recruit the people who could understand the outputs of that service. So to take a very specific and slightly nerdy example of vulnerability scanning, the sort of thing that led to the TalkTalk attack. So attackers scan for vulnerabilities and then attack, but those defending organisations can look at that. Some of those, so if you're DWP and you've got a big budget, you can employ the best commercial vulnerability scanning. If you're one of 15 rural local authorities in Norfolk, you absolutely can't. So we've built something that does a very basic version of this for nothing, and we've got 150 local authorities doing it, and it tells you if your certificates are out of date, and if your certificates are out of date, it then tells you how to fix them, and that means that very basic thing can't be exploited. It's stuff like that. We just do it to local government, and we don't drop memorandums of who's responsible for what.
Great, thank you. Janet, Verify.
We shouldn't have to follow
concrete
that.
steps.
I think also all three.
You can talk about Verify, right?
Well, I think actually, so all three issues come down to the same problem, which is that the people making decisions about shall we back Verify properly or should we just kind of wait and see, should we actually do anything about the things that we put in our strategy. All the people making those decisions, among them, there are very few who actually understand either the nature of the decisions they're taking or the implications of them. This is about a question about capability and leadership, in my view, and also about structural dynamics which create poor conditions for the right sort of decisions to be made. And so for all three of the questions that you've talked about, I would look at what those structural dynamics are and seek to fix them and remove institutional and structural and incentive-based barriers to people collaborating and doing the right thing. I would always call for transparency in doing that. And I would have a massive push on digital capability among leaders in local authorities and government and other institutions. That's what we're doing at Doteveryone. Because if you have leaders, and for example a treasury that's making decisions about where to spend money on technology and what to back, but doesn't understand the technology or the implications of it, there's no hope for anything else good to happen, really. So in terms of practical steps, that would be my number one practical step, is how are we going to get all of those people, not just to understand some information about digital and technology, but to be confident and competent and curious when it comes to digital, so that they are constantly learning and iterating and improving what they're doing and how they work, and become capable of making effective decisions about all of this stuff.
Thank you very much.
I can just quickly add to that in relation to Stefan's question, where he said about, if you say everybody's responsible, then nobody's responsible. I think allied to what Janet is saying there, I think one of the other characteristics that if you look at organisations you would classify as successful digital organisations in the private sector, one of the other things that they have done that has allowed them to be successful is the people at the top have relinquished control.
Yeah.
Organisations that are successful digitally are not top-down hierarchical organisations with a strong command and control structure. They are flat, very, very heavily networked organisations, very heavily collaborative organisations, where the people at all levels of those organisations are given the authority and the empowerment within a predefined scope. They're told the boundaries of the circle around which they have to exist, but they're given a lot of scope to innovate and to do things differently and to try things and to share things and to talk to people about it. GDS was set up to be exactly that sort of organisation, and I think that's where a lot of the banging of heads came from between GDS and the rest of the civil service, because those two cultures are very hard to coexist in one organisation. So I think I think a good way to think is if we're all saying who is responsible, it's everybody, but that's got to start from the people at the top, giving everybody the autonomy to be able to do what needs to be done.
So I think the panel is saying we're asking the wrong question. We're sort of out of time, but there are a lot of people who wanted to ask questions, so I'm going to take just two more questions. And you, sir, we had your hand up first, I think, and then the guy in front.
Thank you. David Bicknell from Government Computing. You made the recommendation of actually having a minister with responsibility for digital government. Surely that actually has to be someone with clout to make things happen. It has to be someone of a Francis Maud ilk, and that was very much of its time. So you can have a minister for digital government, but they've got to have some clout. And I would sort of use the example, okay, I'm talking from a permanent secretary point of view, of someone like Claire Moriarty, who has actually proved that she's, got it, understood it, went to GovCamp, didn't just go and turn up and spend 2 hours there, but pitched a session. So it wants someone who's really going to be available to sort of understand it. And the other thing I would say is, what are going to be the skills and responsibilities, and where will this minister be based? Will it be in the Cabinet Office? If you're talking about responsibilities for Brexit, should it be within the Department for Executive in the EU? If you're going to have that suggestion, then think big about it and maybe think differently, rather than just saying, okay, is it going to be in the Cabinet Office? The other thing I would say is, one last thing, quickly.
Very quickly.
We've lost our focus on some of the SMEs. If you talk to SMEs, they say they don't have the connection with government and the GDS and Cabinet Office that they used to. They've lost the role of people like Stephen Allett, Crown Rep for SMEs. They've lost that capability. They need to get it back.
Okay, thank you. In front,
David Tagorn from the Royal Navy. You spoke about breaking down departments, and that's sort of a utopia in some ways, but what about professions in that sense? So, Ciaran, you mentioned the fact that these local government can even get the jobs if they have the money, because they're so niche. I find that government departments steal from each other for these niche jobs, and even DWP, which does have a bigger budget, I think it's the third time they've recruited for a lead data scientist in the last 12 months, because still those niche jobs are really hard. Why, perhaps on that step-type utopia, at least at a resource level, people level, are we not more professions-based rather than each government department trying to get those niche jobs?
Thanks very much. So really 30 seconds, concluding remarks and answering all the questions and saying
Absolutely agree with what your report says and what David says in terms of a digital minister. I think I wrote something almost about the same time as you did before the election, Dan, saying we need, I actually expanded out. I said we needed somebody responsible not just for digital in government, but for digital generally, for engagement with the digital sectors, with digital economy in the UK as we come into Brexit. And I think that should be a cabinet level post with the sort of authority to go cross government. Broader really broader even than the Francis Maude position. I think we've still got a long way to go before that sort of thinking comes in. When I was coming here this morning, I was reading an article that said several hundred of the civil services top policy people are being moved into all the Brexit departments at the moment. And my immediate question was, are they moving any digital people into the Brexit departments as well? What's going to happen in the Brexit negotiations when...
You're over 30 seconds, by the way.
So everybody else has been.
Yeah, but I'm getting tougher.
Very quickly then, when Michel Barnier is telling David Davis, this is how your customs policy is going to be, and David Davis is thinking, well, do we say yes to that? Where's the digital guy in the background who's going to say, God, if you want us to do that, it's going to take years to develop that with the customs systems we've got. Sadly, that's not there at the moment.
Thank you. Janet.
I think I'll be really short in my concluding remarks. And the thing that I want to say is, this is really difficult. Let's not get into despair just because everything isn't going exactly as we might hope it would and as quickly as we might hope it would. I'm really glad that IFG is here posing these questions and having these debates openly. Let's just not give up and keep going and make everything better.
Thank you. Ciaran.
Similarly optimistic on the government departments stealing from each other. The solution to that is long-term skills. Difficult but essential. On the wider question, to strike perhaps a contrarian note, but something to feel strongly about, if I've learned anything in terms of the cybersecurity wing of this digital government agenda, how you organise yourself and minister for this or that, and the way different bits of the machine should be organised is fundamentally a secondary issue. Strategy is first. Ask yourself the hard strategy questions about what you're trying to achieve and then organise yourself around it. If you do it the other way around, it's a complete waste of time.
Yeah, fully agree.
Very good. We're asking all the wrong questions here today on the panel. Minister for Digital Government, it doesn't really matter where they are so long as they've got authority. I think the Prime Minister should get these issues and talk about it. The Chancellor of the Exchequer should. Cameron and Osborne were talking about this stuff. May and Hammond absolutely haven't. I think Hammond had something in the Mansion House speech, as you mentioned, about Brexit and digital. So that was a start. Let's make the best of that. So perhaps it wasn't a sentence; it was a subclause, I think. Anyway, let's do what we can with that subclause, everybody. Yes, we need more permanent secretaries like Claire Moriarty, and I think that's at last something the panel agrees with, and I'm saying. I think I'm going to wrap it up there. So read the report. There are lots of concrete things that government and the public sector can do to add to the excellent examples that the panel has been giving today. Thank you for bearing with us slightly overrunning. Please join me in thanking our excellent panel.